I find object arrays to be really helpful in reducing my code in a lot of cases. Let's consider we have a form that has 7 different text boxes, and I want to have a button that maybe would clear all 7 of those text boxes and set the color maybe to cyan. And I have a button that would have basically 14 statements to do that, setting txta.clear and txtb.clear and so forth, and txta.backcolor equals color.cyan. And if I have 20 or 30 text boxes, my code just got a lot longer. But I can do it much more efficiently if I create an object array. So in this example, I have dimmed my text boxes as text box. Notice that my text boxes has the parentheses, so it's an array. And it's going to equal, and I'm setting up the elements of my text box to be my 7 text boxes. I named them txta, txtb, and so forth through txtg. Then I can use a for each loop to iterate through all of the text boxes in that array. So for each tb as text box in my text boxes, I'm going to do tb.clear and tb.backcolor equals color.cyan. And the result of that is the text boxes are cleared and they each become cyan. And if I had 20 text boxes, the only thing I would change would be dimming my text box array to include all 20 text boxes. Now, one problem that comes up is I want to create my text boxes as a class level or global array. And the problem that I encounter is if I dim my text boxes as text box and I say it's going to equal txta, txtb, txtc, you'll see the red squiggly and you'll get an error because at that class level, when we're declaring that, those text boxes have not yet been created. In other words, it's going to load our Form1 class and run those class level statements before it's created the GUI interface. So how do I get around that? I'm going to show you 2 ways. One is to create my text boxes as a text box. And I know from creating the GUI interface that I have 7 text boxes. And so I dim my text boxes as having 7 elements, 0 to 6. That's at the class level. I haven't populated it. Then I can populate it in the form load, because the form load code runs right after the GUI has been established. In my form load, I'm going to dim temp as a text box and populate temp array with my 7 different text boxes. Now that temp array only exists in the form load, and I haven't yet affected my text boxes as far as the class level array. But I can use a for next loop to go through the elements of temp. And here I've got a for I as integer equals 0 to temp length minus 1. Remember, I want to go 1 less than the length. So it's going to go from 0 to 6. And I'm going to set element I of my text boxes to be element I of temp. I have now populated my text boxes as a class level variable that I can refer to and use in other procedures within my program. Another way to do this would be to dim my text boxes as a class level variable, again with 7 elements going from 0 to 6. And then in my form load, to dim a variable, I'm going to use idx as index as an integer equals 0. And then I can look at me.controls. Me.controls is a collection of all the controls in the form. And I can say for each obj, that's my variable name, as object, I'm going to look at every object in me.controls. If the type of the object is a text box, then I'm going to add that object to my text box's element idx. It's going to start out as 0. So that once I've loaded that in, I want to increment idx. And that will load all the text boxes into that array. Now make sure when you do that the number of text boxes you have matches the number of elements in your my text box array. Otherwise you'll get an error because it'll be out of bounds. Let's take a look at this in an application in Visual Basic. You'll recall that a couple of units ago I demonstrated a project of using nested loops. And we created this checkerboard as our GUI interface, but we did it all with code. And in the code we created 64 labels, some of which were dark and some of which were white. And we did that using numerical values. I'm going to refactor this project a little bit and show you how we might use object arrays to take this to the next step. In this version, I've added some buttons that will allow us to change the colors of the dark squares or the light squares. And I'm going to do that using object arrays, so that each one of these buttons, when we click on it, sets a color to each of the objects in the object array, so all the dark squares and all the light squares. Let's take a look at the code for that. So before I go to the code, let's talk about the user interface here. I have this empty area on the left-hand side, which is our checkerboard that's generated by code. But I added then a couple labels and 24 buttons. 12 for the dark square colors and 12 for the light square colors. I didn't bother naming these. I'm not going to refer to the names in code. All of the dark squares use the same handler. All the light squares use another handler. And all I did was create the buttons and just change the back color to get my different colors. We're going to use whatever the color of the button is to change the color of our black squares or white squares. So in the code, I added two label arrays, one called white squares, one called black squares. They both have elements from 0 to 31. So 32 elements each, that's my 64 squares. Still generating the squares the same way as I did before. I added two variables for white index and black index as integers and set them both equal to 0. After I've added the label to my interface, I use that same information that we did with setting the color to black or white in our ternaries. So j plus 1 mod 2, if it's 0, then this is a black square, and I'm going to add it to the black squares element black index will equal the new label. And then I'm going to increment that index. Now, index is also if that's not equal to 0, then it's a light colored square. I'm going to add it to the white squares using the white index element. And we'll increment white index. That populates my two label arrays. Then the code to handle those 12 different buttons for the dark colors. I'm going to dim dark as color equals center.backColors. Where the back color is of the button that I clicked, it's going to go into the dark variable. And then for each square in black squares, that's my 32 dark squares, I'm going to set square.backColor equal to dark. I do the same thing for the light squares. This time I'm using light as my variable. It's going to equal center.backColor. I'm going to set each square in white squares to square.backColor equals light. And so you can see that object arrays can make changing a whole bunch of objects at the same time very simple, efficient, and effective. If you just jumped into this video, you can see all the videos from the Programming Practicum playlist by clicking on the image in the lower right. And if you'd like to be alerted to future videos I create, you can click my picture in the top right to subscribe to the channel.